Good morning to everyone who's joining us. Great to see you all joining us today. Although I suppose should say we can't actually see you, but we are very conscious that you are all out there. So a very warm welcome to everybody. I'm Jenny Beresford-Jones, Senior Legal Advisor and Public Procurement Specialist in the procurement team here at Mills Reeve. And today we are homing in on the impact of the Procurement Act on works contracts. And this is always an area where there are many nuances and sector-specific issues to consider. So to help us think about all of that, I am delighted to be joined by two construction procurement experts and close colleagues, Stuart Thompson, who's a partner, and Dominic Taylor, who is a senior associate. So lovely to have you both with us. In terms of housekeeping today, just to note that the session's been recorded, and also to confirm that, as usual, a copy of the slides and the recording will be circulated after the event. So don't worry about having to take lots of notes and all that kind of thing. If you've got any legal questions, do put those in the Q&A box. We don't take questions in the session itself, but we will come back to you in a Q&A document, which will come around with these slides and the recording. If you've got any technical issues, so you can't see us or hear us, again, put a note in the Q&A box, and Sarah, who's looking after the technical side, thank you, Sarah, we'll try and help you. So just a word on implementation. So as we know, we've got that go live date now of 24th of February 2025. But the government has been busy, things have been happening, and particularly the procurement pathway tool was issued at the end of September. And if you've not seen that, that's where the government's going to be publishing all the templates as it's issuing in relation to the Act. And we've already seen a few of those coming through, conflicts assessment templates, assessment summaries, for example, and lots more to come. Guidance on the central digital platform, which we have all been waiting for, was released on the 29th of October. And together with it, there was an update saying that they're expecting to be onboarding authorities to the new platform from the end of January 2025. So you should all have 3 or 4 weeks or so before the go live date to have a play around with it. So government's been busy, but we also in the team here have been busy on our procurement portal, which we have reissued and refreshed with all sorts of lovely new content around the Act. And in particular, a couple of things that we really wanted to just flag, as we hope they'll be helpful. The first of those is our new notices generator tool, which is very exciting. We're really thrilled with. You can tell it if you're a central or a sub-central authority, what's the value of the contract you're procuring, if it's works, goods or services, if it's an ordinary contract, light touch, call off. You put that information in, press go, and miraculously it tells you which notices you need and explains the information that goes into them. And we hope that that will be really useful, as when you really drill down into the detail of all that, there are a lot of nuances around what notices are required for different types of contracts. We know that our standstill calculator is really popular, so we've updated that so that it works with the new standstill period under the Act. But if you still need to use the old one, don't despair, because that's still available on the portal too. It's going to be time for me to stop talking shortly, but I just wanted to flag that today Stuart and Dom are going to be talking about contract changes, the CFP, evaluation criteria, and performance management in the works context. Of course, if you want a more general introduction to those, do go back and have a look at our previous 5 and 25s. They're all available on the procurement portal. And I think I will be quiet now and hand over to the people you're really interested in hearing from. So over to Dominic, who's going to talk to us about the potential to use a CFP in a works context. Thank you, Dom.
Thanks, Jenny, and good morning, everyone. Yes, so the first thing we're going to look at is how you might use the new flexible procedure to procure your construction contracts. So as you probably all know, the new flexible procedure, it's a new procedure under the Act, and I think it's very much replacing the old restricted, negotiated and competitive dialogue procedures, which were under the regulations. Now, the Act defines as such other competitive tendering procedure as the contracting authority considers appropriate for the purposes of awarding a public contract. I think that's quite an open definition. I think there's a sense that this might give the flexibility required I think there was a general feeling among construction lawyers that the old regulations, the procedures under them didn't quite fit with how you want to procure a construction contract. And I think the hope is that this additional flexibility might be quite useful. That's not to say complete flexibility. There's still obviously requirements around equal treatment, award criteria to award the contract, publishing documents, etc. But hopefully there's a bit more flexibility. And the government guidance which accompanies the Act gives some ideas of what you might want to include in your competitive flexible procedure. So negotiation stages, dialogue stages, maybe some site visits, interviews. Not a big fan for lawyers, but we know the clients really like them. And then maybe some post-award or post-preferred bidder negotiations. So that's just the general overview. We've only got a short period of time, but I thought what might be quite useful is to think how the competitive flexible procedure could be different to the restricted procedure. We often find the restricted sort of the go-to for procuring contracts. So hypothetical example, design and build contracts, how might you use a new flexible procedure? So that initial selection stage, obviously restricted procedure, it was a distinct stage before you go into tender. There is the ability under the new flexible procedure to maybe combine with an initial tender stage if you were looking at that. You could then down select from that and then go on to future tenders. So that ability is there. I think just personally, I think probably stick with just a single selection stage. And one of the reasons for that is sort of the next point. So under the old restricted procedure, there was no ability to negotiate terms and conditions. What we do have now is the potential, though, for having a sort of a little negotiation at the start with all those bidders who were down selected from selection stage around some of the terms and conditions. So say it was that two-stage design and build contract, say it was NEC4, for example. You might want to just see if some of those compensation events, you want to switch them off and on between the two stages. Maybe if you're looking at fee percentages, you may say we want a fee percentage in stage one, which is different to the fee percentage from stage two. And if it was the NEC, say it was X22, do we want a budget incentive? So you could sort of sort those issues out initially before re-releasing it to the market for them to submit their actual tenders. If you've made those amendments as well, you may think, actually, we need to refine the award criteria. And the Act and the new competitive flexible procedure does allow that. So Section 24 allows authorities to refine the award criteria if it's made clear in the tender documents and before initial tenders are submitted. So after that down selection, you could say, you could be clear in your tender documents. We're not sure if we want two fee percentages. We do know the fee percentage will say be 20% of the price. If we agree on two fee percentages, we may split that 10% each. And there is that flexibility under the Act. Now, it's not to say, again, that you've got complete freedom to do what you want, but it's something certainly to think about. So you've refined your award criteria. You may go, okay, we just want a straightforward tender stage. And obviously you can do that. But you can include some things around, say, demonstration of modern methods of construction. You could have those interviews, which we lawyers hate, and then you could get your tenders back and do the assessment. And the final thing to consider is something which is sort of stole from the old competitive dialogue procedure. Once you have that preferred bidder, could you have some form of negotiation on those terms and conditions? Nothing major, but maybe around the KPIs, as we'll see later in today's session. KPIs are quite large under the new Procurement Act, and you could use that post preferred bidder stage just to sort of agree what they'll be going forward. Now that is a very, very quick whistle-stop tour of the competitive flexible procedure, but just some ideas you might want to think about there. So I'm just going to hand out to Stuart, who's going to look at the meat versus mat.
Thank you, Dom. And Dom's already trailed that there's a bit more flexibility when looking at the CFP, and we think there's also some flexibility moving to the mat test away from the meat test. And what I'll do in dealing with question 2 is have a little bit of what are we doing at the moment, have a look at that, and then compare that with what we could be doing in a few years' time. So currently, thinking about our two-stage D&B that Dom has referred to, and Dom's referred to the NEC4, but it also applies to the JCT contract as well. So if that's a contract that you're familiar with, then the concepts and the principles that Dom and I are discussing apply to JCT as well as the NEC4. And under the current regulations, the meat test has developed into the price quality ratio, which we all know and love, and a form of evaluation criteria may look something like this, where price is 25% of the overall score, quality 65%, and you've got social value in there as well. Now, thinking about how that then plays into some of the commercial evaluation on a two-stage D&B, On stage one, what it tends to lead to is a stage one PCSA fee or evaluating a stage one rate card, as well as often looking at what the prelims cost may be during the construction phase. And all of that is absolutely fine, but there are a couple of issues that arise out of that sort of approach. And they relate to price certainty, particularly on a two-stage D&B, that at the time you're going out to competition, by the time you have selected your bidder, yes, you have certainty around the PCSA fee, but you don't have certainty around the target cost or the proposed building contract cost going forwards. So that's one issue which we often grapple with. The second is because price is still an important part of the criteria, it can result in a race to the bottom. And a consequence of that is that the quality of the works may suffer. So is there a chance to move away from some of those issues under the Act? So here's a summary of the Act, and you can see there are a couple of points to note. One is that we lose the economic element of the test, which was referred to in the headline slide. And the second is that although price is still referred to within one of the sections, it's not as prominent as it has been under the regulations that we've been dealing with to date. So are we likely to see the same sort of price quality ratio that we currently use on works procurements? And are we wedded to the sort of commercial questions that we often ask bidders to bid back on? Well, our view is that when you look at the Act, there's a bit more flexibility that authorities can take advantage of. And thinking about the first stage of a two-stage D&B, there are a few examples on the slide that have just shown up. So one is you can ask the bidders to lock in a date when they are prepared to say when they will commit to a target cost. And that offers authorities value for money because it allows you to plan for budgets and to plan for the project in general. Similarly, and Dom's referred to it before, that it might be that the stage one price is a little bit higher because a contractor is prepared to de-risk the project during stage one by, for example, taking on ground risk if it's paid to undertake surveys, and then switch off that compensation event during the construction phase. And again, that offers significant value for money for a contracting authority if it knows that that compensation event has been switched off at the outset. And similarly, on the cash flow profile and the spend curve, if the authority is prepared to front load some of the costings for long lead items, for example, that may also result in a slightly higher stage one cost, but ultimately result in value for money for the project overall. And there are other items that will occur during stage two, or if you're only having a single stage, then these are things you can ask at the outset. One may be around delay damages, for example, that if a contractor or an authority is prepared to offer a tiered approach to delay damages or a delay damages free period, or even have a lower rate of delay damages, is there an upside for the project overall in that the terminal float is reduced and the overall program is shortened so that you can get in and use your new facility quicker than you might have done if delay damages was running at a higher rate? And there are some other examples on there as well around the insurance package and retention. We can see some flexibility around how you could evaluate those. And one of the important ones will be how do you start to evaluate KPIs and the fee at risk percentage, etc., which Dom will come on to. So I think our conclusion is that we're not going to lose price completely, but there are more opportunities out there to develop a more flexible approach to evaluation at the outset. So it may allow authorities to evaluate a little bit smarter under the Act. Dom, over to you.
Thanks, Stuart. So just going to look at KPIs, and they're sort of under the spotlight in the new Procurement Act. And that's because Section 52 has created a new statutory obligation that when a contracting authority is procuring a public contract with an estimated value of over £5 million, they need to set at least 3 key performance indicators before entering the contract, which will then subsequently be published. Now, obviously, you'll see a works contract. The threshold there is 5.372 million. So if you're entering into a works contract, which is a public contract, that is to say, above the threshold, you will be caught by this requirement. Now, it might not be brand new for people. So those working in central government will know they've been required to publish 3 KPIs and to monitor performance against that. But it is now a statutory obligation, and it'll flow through not just those central government authorities, but also local authorities, NHS trusts, and potentially even some universities. So what is a KPI? Well, it's defined under the Act as a factor or measure against which the supplier's performance of a contract can be assessed during the life cycle of the contract. The first thing that jumps out to me, life cycle of a contract. So if you've got a straightforward build contract, you pick up the design at the end of week before and you're just constructing. The KPIs are very different to say if you've got a design, build, operate contract, but potentially you need to set KPIs which can last from 5, 10, 15 years. So that setting those KPIs at the start could be quite a difficult task and require some thought. Worth saying there is an exemption. Section 52.2 says that the contracting authority, when they consider the supplier's performance is not capable of being appropriately assessed, they don't require KPIs. Now, the guidance which comes with the Act gave an example of sort of a one-off goods delivery or an off-the-shelf good. So I think it'll be difficult to justify that exemption if you're looking at a works contract with the length of the contract, that relationship dynamic. So my starting assumption would be if you're procuring a construction contract, which is a public works contract, you're going to have to look at setting these KPIs. So that's setting KPIs. Obviously, the Act goes further on monitoring them. So Section 71 creates a requirement for authorities to assess the performance of a supplier against those KPIs every 12 months. You then need to publish a contract performance notice against the 3 KPIs which are most material for the performance of the obligations for those 12 months. Now, the Cabinet Office guidance is useful in saying those 3 KPIs can differ by year. So take a 2-stage design and build contract. Those first KPIs might be focused on the design. When you come to year 4, they may be more focused on the construction. So as you'll see on the screen there, just some potential ideas for KPIs. The design stage, potentially how many times has the design been rejected before it gets accepted. We get to the construction phase, you may be looking at health and safety, the number of defects in a 12-month period. Are they hitting certain conditions by key dates? If you've got forecasts, are they hitting those forecasts? So this the sort of stuff you may be used to already. Worth just jumping through to the actual standard terms and conditions, which I'm sure most of you deal with day to day. So both the JCT and the NEC4 include KPI performance regimes. And under both of them, there's a requirement for the contractor to perform against them. And if they fail to hit them, have some sort of performance improvement plan. So that goes quite nicely with the requirements around publishing performance against KPIs. The one I just want to delve into for a brief moment is that NEC and the fact that there's an incentive payment under that NEC regime. Now, as we'll see in a few questions' time, the monitoring of performance against KPIs could potentially have quite considerable impacts on contractors down the line. So when you've got the NEC, you've got this incentive mechanic where an incentive payment is paid if they hit their KPI. This runs alongside this Procurement Act, almost a stick approach. So you'll have these 2 twin tracks. It'll be interesting to see how that affects performance. There's also an additional point to make on the NEC is that there's the ability, obviously, to add KPIs through the lifetime of the contract. The trick is, unfortunately, the Act requires you to monitor and publish performance against the KPIs set before entering into contract. So you couldn't actually add KPIs in year 4 of the contract and publish against them. Obviously not ideal, but it is where we are. And when we move on to looking at contract performance management, you'll see how it potentially all flows through anyway. I'm just going to give back now to Stuart, who's going to look at contract modifications.
Thank you, Dom. And for this part, again, I'll do a little bit of look back and then compare it with what it may look like once the Act comes into force next year. So contract change is something that we're often asked to advise on, and we're often asked, how can we craft our change so that we fit within the PCR Reg 72 and the changes permitted? And often that's fairly straightforward, and clients don't need our advice for too long. But quite often we are nudging and massaging the proposed change to try and shoehorn it into the safe harbors provided for by Reg 72. And what I'll look at on the next slide is whether or not we still need that shoehorn under the Act, or are there more reasons, permitted reasons, which we can rely upon when dealing with proposed modifications once the contract goes live. So this is under the PCR, and just compare it with where we are under the Act. So a couple of points to note. One is that when determining one of the three tests, and the first two, the non-substantial test and the below threshold test, it's a plus or minus test here. So if you're adding or omitting the value of the works, then the omit is taken into account when determining whether or not you comply with those first two tests. And I'll deal with that under a works contract in a few moments. The second point to note is, although I've got more words on this slide than I had under the PCR slide, in broad terms, the Act and the way it deals with modifications is broadly similar with the PCR. There are a couple of new additions when you look at the permitted modifications under Schedule 8, one of which is the known risk. That probably is a new provision that's come in. The other deals with urgency and life risk that was probably dealt with under the regs anyway, under a different provision. But if you want to know a little bit more about that in detail, then Jenny's referred to one of our other webinars that look at change and the various sections in more detail. That's already dealt with under another webinar. So how do these provisions affect a works contract? Well, again, if we take a two-stage D&B and look at how change may arise during stage one, and in stage one, the design is being developed and the main contractor is liaising with its supply chain to firm up the price. And it might be that the final fixed price is much higher than the indicative budget that was set out within the procurement documents. If that occurs, then it's our view that we're not really in the world of modification as provided for by Section 74 onwards. We're simply dealing with firming up an indicative price. So you're probably okay there. Where it can become a little bit more troublesome is if the final business case and affordability issues crop up, which mean that certain elements of the scope have to be omitted from the contract, and the effect of that is plus 15% or minus 15% on the overall price, then at that stage, we may well move into a change which has to be provided for by the Act. So in that situation, if you think there could be affordability issues, then it may be that you should ensure that the procurement documents and the contract itself provide for those to ensure that that change is permitted. So there are a couple of instances that could arise before the contract's signed and when you're dealing with things under the PCSA. Looking at sorts of risks that arise during the construction phase, it's very rare indeed that a final construction price and or program is the same as the tendered price or program. Things happen that have an impact on the project itself, that have an impact on the project, and those issues can result in the price going up. In our view, if you're dealing with a project risk around site condition risk or something else, then again, we don't feel that you're touching on Section 74 onwards. That's something that's just provided for as contract management. Where it can become a little bit murkier is if a client is relying upon the compensation event regime or the change and variation provisions in JCT to add stuff into the scope. An example there may be that once you get planning permission, it frees up an extra bit of land and you want to add something to the scope itself. Or if it's a term service contract and you wish to use a task order to instruct services or works that are not quite dealt with within the scope that was tendered at the time. If you're moving into using the contract in that way, then in our view, you are drifting into the world of Section 74 onwards, and you must ensure that if the value of the cumulative value of those changes goes plus or minus 15% for a works contract, that you need a permitted reason for doing that. And if you don't have a permitted reason, then I suspect that the shoehorn will be out and we'll be trying to nudge and massage your proposed change to ensure that it does comply with one of the reasons set out within Schedule 8. Something else just to bear in mind that under the regs, the modification notice could be issued after the change takes effect. But under the Act, the contract change notice should be published before the modification takes effect. So there's a little bit of additional risk there if someone in the marketplace is a bit grumpy that you've added in a whole new floor of on a works contract, that they may have bid for that. There's more scope for them to be troublesome if you are proposing to change a contract in that way. Dom, over to you.
Thanks, Stuart. So the final thing we're going to look at is around contract performance management in works contracts, and in particular, contract performance notices. And to me, this is the area under the Act which could have the biggest impact on construction contracts, and particularly for contractors. So we touched on it briefly under the KPIs around publishing contract performance notice against their performance. But in addition to that, there's two other areas. So a requirement to publish notices in the event of a supplier breach, and then also in the event of unremedied supplier poor performance. Now, the one I want to focus on is that unremedied supplier poor performance, because I think this has the potential to really grow some legs. So under the Act, Section 71(4) requires contracting authorities to publish a contract performance notice if the contractor is not performing a public contract to the authority's satisfaction, they have given the contractor a proper opportunity to improve performance, but the contractor has failed to do so. It's a requirement to publish this notice, which sets out the circumstances that give rise to that to the notice, and then additional information which is included in the regulations. For example, if there's improvement plans which have not obviously gone to plan. So why is it a worry? Well, first thing, let's look at the actual standard form terms and conditions and what actually might trigger this. So take the NEC4, ECC, just take the idea of defects. So obviously there's a requirement under the contract to correct defects before the end of the defect correction period. Now under clause 46.1, if the contractor fails to correct those defects, the project manager assesses the cost to the client of having the defect corrected, and the contractor pays this amount. Now it's interesting to think, would that trigger the section, the notice? There's been poor performance in the form of the defect, they've been given the opportunity to improve performance in terms of that contract and that defect correction period, but obviously they've failed to do so, hence the payment. Potentially a trigger. You may think, okay, well, defect correction period is just the end of the contract, it doesn't matter. But if you had, say you had sections, 3 or 4 sections, say it was the end of section 1, there's potential that this notice gets published and there's still 3 or 4 more years to go in the contract. Some other things to think about, say they're failing to hit conditions by certain key dates. Say it's an option E contract and you've got to provide your forecast and the forecast is constantly wrong. Could that trigger poor performance, give the option to improve, but fail to do so? There's also the KPI point. So as well as the obligation around monitoring those initial KPIs, say you have more KPIs and they're not hitting them, they've got a requirement to improve performance, but they failed to do so. Could that trigger this contract poor performance notice? Remember, it's an obligation on the authority if they feel there has been poor performance and they fail to improve to actually publish this notice. Now, they're just hypothetical examples. You'd obviously have to dig into the detail, but it's something to think about. And you may be thinking, okay, contract poor performance notice, maybe a bit of bad publicity, but actually, what is the worry? The problem is when you jump to Schedule 7 of the Act, which makes clear that if you have a contract poor performance notice published against you, you become an excludable supplier for the purposes of the Act. And how could that flow through? Well, Section 78 includes an implied right to terminate a contract if a contractor becomes an excludable supplier. There's also the point around, say you were awarded a works contract from a CCS framework agreement and your call-off contract is terminated. Most CCS frameworks include something which says, for call-off contract is terminated, your position on the framework itself can be terminated. There's also the point around, if you're excludable, potentially you're not being allowed to bid for future contracts. Now, there's lots of protections in the Act around cleaning and whatnot, but it's something to bear in mind for contractors. Given the impact, we may look at seeing if authorities want to build something into early warning regimes, just so there's an early warning if they look at publishing one of these notices, maybe including something in a dispute avoidance provisions, just to make sure that these things aren't just triggered. I know there's been lots of talk around whether authorities need to put the same protection in their own internal procedures that they may have, even equivalent to entering into contract, just given the potential knock-on impact. And the final point I'd make is there's an argument to say that if these performance notices are being published on numerous occasions and everyone becomes an excludable supplier, are we in a position where if everyone's an excludable supplier, no one's an excludable supplier? So potentially quite a big impact, something to think about there. I'm just going to hand back to Jenny.
Thank you, Dom. So it's 10:30. It's probably time for us to stop, let you all get on with your day. When the webinar ends, there should be a feedback form which pops up. So really appreciate it if you could fill that in, because it helps us to plan our sessions and make sure that they're relevant. Do look out for the recording, the slides, and the Q&A document. We'll come back to you on some of those interesting questions that have been raised in the chat. The procurement portal, www.procurementportal.com, is now up and working. I think it just went down temporarily just at the moment that I gave a plug for it, hopefully. So our next 5 in 25 is going to be in January 2025, and that's when Shaylee and I will be looking at the latest state of play as we get closer to that February implementation date, which I'm sure will come very quickly and loom quite large. So do look out for an invitation to that coming your way. And that's it for now. So a very big thank you from Stuart, from Dominic, and from me. Have a good run up to the Christmas break, and we'll see you in January 2025.